Hello everybody, this is Eli with Elfbait. Welcome back. Today I want to talk about first level or low level adventures and how to make them more interesting. It's a common argument that I hear, or a common complaint I hear, is that there aren't enough interesting monsters at low levels to really make encounters really special. And there's some truth to that. I mean, low level monsters tend to be pretty basic creatures. They either don't have a lot of hit points, or and then they have like maybe one special ability, or they do have just nothing but a bunch of hit points, and that's their challenge. So it can be hard, especially if you've been playing the game for a long time, to keep coming up with interesting encounters. And so I wanted to talk about low-level adventures and how they can really benefit from extra story and more skill usage. If you look at a character, like in 5th edition, for example, if you look at a 5th edition character, their combat abilities are going to change much more rapidly and dynamically than their skill abilities. But they start out better or as good as with their skills that they're going to be for like the first 3 or 5 levels. Whereas their combat abilities and their special abilities for the class are going to kind of increase at a much faster rate, and so are going to change. But early on, your characters are actually slightly better off in the category of skills and attribute saves and all of that than they are going to be in combat abilities. So when you're making these low-level adventures, you can get a lot more character and a lot more, I don't know, just gravity to that adventure by lessening the reliance on combat encounters and picking up the skill game, the plot game, the story game. This way, your players, your adventure will be more robust. Your players will be going through an adventure, and rather than fighting goblins, and then now we're fighting wolves, and oh look, a spider, and oh look, some skeletons, and more skeletons. Oh look, human bandits. And oh look, the king's men, which are the same stats as the bandits, but they're just in different clothes. That can get tiresome. And those low-level adventures, depending on how your campaign's being run, they might have a lot of that same, very much just almost reskinned enemies. Wild dogs are going to hit and fight pretty much like kobolds or goblins. And so by taking a step back and looking at your adventures in terms of greater story, you can kind of counter this. So what do you do to make your adventure more story focused? Well, you don't have to change any of the core elements of your story. You just have to add more in to where you're to what's going on to accomplish that story. So, for example, the game I'm running right now, the new campaign that I'm running, the first adventure starts with a very basic fairy tale setup. There is a blacksmith who's made a deal with one of the fairy folk, and he's trying to renege on it, so the fairy is plaguing him. The party is called on, or takes it upon themselves, to help him deal with this fairy problem. Now, this could be run as a very basic setup. We could short form all of that initial setup to where the party is approached by the blacksmith. Help me save my daughter and save my business, my smithy from this fairy folk. Go out and get rid of him. And that's how a lot of adventures would start. They're going to very much can the intro and get it going to where the party then immediately knows where they're going. Next thing you know, they're on their way, and they're going to fight a thing, and there's going to be another encounter with a thing. There might be a skill check to get across a chasm or something like that, and then ultimately it comes down to the fight with the big bad, and mission accomplished. The fairy is either vanquished, killed, defeated, fooled, tricked, whatever. So what I did instead, though, in this situation is I placed the party in the town. Did not have them start in a tavern, although some of them decided that they were in the tavern to begin with. And then it created a situation where they found there was a disturbance in the village. They investigated the disturbance, and then from there, it went down this chain of events where they had to try and ascertain what was going on. They had to role play. There were some skill checks, perception and insight were used. There were attempts at persuasion to try and get people to talk. At one point, while one character is discussing things with the town magistrate, another character is off talking to the blacksmith's daughter, trying to get some information from her. It became kind of a police procedural in a way, but that was sort of the intent. But already, the tapestry of this adventure is being woven a little tighter and with a little bit more texture and complexity, in that we're having now this the concept of having to find that information, skill checks, and story. And so even before they're on the adventure has already gone through many steps of added roleplay, all based on the character's skills and attributes rather than based on their combat abilities or their special abilities. Now, granted, some of that could play in. If they had the right spells, they could have cast spells to persuade the townsfolk to talk to them or to gain insight on some of the clues that were left. But instead, we had a dwarf who was used his proficiency in smith's tools to examine the metal that was, that the villagers were saying was cheap metal. The claim was that the blacksmith had been cheating them, and so they examined the metal. So, and then there's looking into insights and asking around to the other town folk to try and get a handle on the character of the blacksmith. This led up to 3 hours of role playing before we hadn't even actually got into any combat. It was all role playing, it was all fun, but the party was having fun. The players were having, not the party, but the players were having fun. The party was actually frustrated at certain points, but it was all in character. You can be frustrated in character as long as you're not frustrated out of character. But the players themselves were playing, and they were enjoying it, and they were interacting with each other, and their characters were interacting with the NPCs, and they were interacting with the environment, and we haven't even got to an encounter. Now, in the upcoming game sessions, there may be combats, and certainly D&D, part of it is combat. But as you can see here, the idea is to, the adventure could easily have been, here's your MacGuffin, go get it. In this case, they had to find out exactly what the MacGuffin was, and now they have to go get it. It's a small change, but it's a pretty important change. It can greatly change and greatly inform the level of fun and play you're going to have at the table. Now, this could also work in other ways, too. I mean, that was the example that I used, but, if you're going to add other elements of roleplay, your NPCs are going to be more important. So you're going to want to spend a little bit of time on who's in the town. What I did is actually in the adventure is I created, at the top of the adventure, I had a map, and I created a key that named all the locations. It's a small enough village, and the assumption was the players had been there for some time. So I put out a key of named locations, what businesses were there and what farms and stuff were there in the village. That way they could say where they were going to want to go talk and talk, and look into things. There was certainly the opportunity for them to look for more information on those locations, and certainly skill checks and could have produced that, or talking to other characters and NPCs. But it doesn't have to necessarily be NPCs. You could have other elements of play that are involved in expanding those early adventures. Don't forget skill challenges, puzzles. These things are going to be as accessible to a first level through third level character as they are really to like a fifth or seventh or so level character. So early on, you're not going to necessarily have to threaten your party with combat constant repetitive battle after battle where really just the flavor of the opponent changes, you can mix it up with tests of strength, dexterity, willpower. Don't forget just plot-driven magic elements. You know, if you're dealing with something that's supposed to be spectral and ghostly, you can still do that at early levels, but don't feel like you have to throw a ghost at your party. A ghost is going to be a pretty brutal challenge for an early level party. However, they could still be haunted. They could still deal with visitations and phantasms and stuff, you know, or dreams that have spectral elements to them that engage their skills rather than outright combat. You could even actually have combat-oriented things occurring in these imagined encounters or these illusory encounters that are based on their skills and attributes rather than their combat abilities. So, for example, you know, if a player is in a dream being subjected to some sort of horrible, monstrous encounter, have them make wisdom or intelligence checks to try and get through it, to try and realize that it's a dream or determine the way out of it, find the key. Now, you can also have them simply roleplay this. It depends on how much depth you want to put into that encounter. Do you want to detail out the whole dream sequence and then have them actually roleplay through it? Sure. Or can you describe what they've seen in a narrative sense and just have them make a couple of checks? You don't want to bog down necessarily too much on every little visitation, but you can certainly do it and make sure that there's, you know, something for them to bite onto other than a combat. But, you know, crossing that river, getting up that hillside, convincing the cleric at the shrine to give them the information, distracting the cleric at the shrine so they can steal the artifact. These things are all things that early parties can do that are going to, I think, add more fun and entertainment to those early adventures. And especially if you're playing with an experienced group of players who've been through a lot of adventures, it's going to be, I think, rewarding to them to not have to just grind through combat after combat. They've probably fought goblins 1,000 times over. Excuse me. Ghost of the cold. But unless you can come up with a really interesting way to spice up goblins again, you might have to select another monster, but you can also just use a non-combat encounter or a story element to really help with those early adventures and make them more interesting. Not to mention, early parties can only handle so many combats before their resources get diminished to the point where they're having to make long rests and stuff. And if you want to break that cycle of having your party rest every time there's a combat, having these other story-based elements can lengthen that adventure out. Not to where it feels like it's being artificially lengthened and therefore just kind of boring and procedural, but it can make it feel like there's been a greater experience rather than go to the cave, kill the 6 goblins that are there, rescue the kid. So, you know, in brief, look at broadening out those early adventures, expanding on them with encounters that are role-play or skill-based. You know, certainly you can have combative things that are not necessarily dealing with combat, and just adding in some of the story elements that you might normally hand players, having them have to work through those, excuse me, is a way for you to also add some spice to these adventures. Hopefully this has been helpful for you. I mean, I if you're like me and you played a lot of low-level adventures in the past, whether that's DMing them or playing them, it can be nice to have some interesting new ways to make them fascinating and fun to play again, instead of getting to that point where you just have everybody roll up a 6th level character, 7th level character because you just want to get on with it. If you have any of your own advice or comments on what I've said here, go ahead and drop them in the comments below. Love those comments. Like, share, and subscribe. Get the word out. And, as always, the most important thing, get out in game.